Depression as denial of the self. Depression consists of a denial of one's own emotional reactions. This denial begins in the service of an absolutely essential adaptation during childhood and indicates a very early injury. There are many children who have not been free, right from the beginning, to experience the very simplest of feelings, such as discontent, anger, rage, pain, even hunger, and, of course, enjoyment of their own bodies. Beatrice, 58, the daughter of missionary parents and a sufferer of deep depression, never knew whether she was hungry or not. Her mother had written proudly in her diary that at the age of 3 months, Beatrice had already learned to wait to be fed and to suppress her hunger without crying. Discontent and anger aroused uncertainty in her mother, and her children's pain made her anxious. Her children's enjoyment of their bodies aroused both her envy and her shame about what other people would think. Under such circumstances, a child may learn very early in life what she is not supposed to feel. If we have thrown away the keys to understanding our lives, the causes of depression, as well as those of all suffering, illness, and healing, must remain a mystery to us, regardless of whether we call ourselves psychiatrists or authorities in the sciences, or both. When psychiatrists with decades of experience have never dared to face their own reality and have instead spent their time, and their parents' time, talking about dysfunctional families, they will need a concept like higher power or God to explain to themselves the miracle of healing. They will then behave like people who are faithfully trying to follow a map without realizing that the first step they took was in the wrong direction. Because they have lost the way from the very start, their scientific fidelity to the map doesn't give them the expected results and doesn't take them where they want to go. I would like to illustrate this with an example. A psychiatrist whose book was sent to me by a reader argues that mistreatment, neglect, and exploitation in childhood cannot be the only causes of psychic illnesses. There must, he feels, be other irrational reasons that can explain why one person apparently escapes the catastrophic effects of abuse, or at least able to heal more quickly, while another seems to suffer more intensely or for a longer time. It must, he suspects, be grace. He reports the story of a patient who lived with his single mother in extreme poverty for the first year of his life and who was then taken away from her by the authorities. He was placed in one foster home after another, and in all of them the child was severely mistreated. But when he became a psychiatric patient, he healed faster than many others with less obvious stories of abuse. How could this man, who had endured unspeakable cruelty in his childhood and youth, liberate himself so readily from his symptoms? Was it with God's help? Many people love this type of explanation without raising a very significant question. Shouldn't we ask why God was willing neither to help other patients of this psychiatrist nor to help this man when he was being beaten mercilessly as a child? Was it really God's grace that helped him as an adult, or is the explanation more prosaic? If this man had a mother who, in spite of her poverty, gave him real love, respect, protection, and security in his first year, he would have had a better start in life and would then have been better able to deal with later abuse than would a patient whose integrity was injured from the first day of her life, as was Beatrice, for instance. Beatrice was not physically mistreated in her youth. She did, however, have to learn as a small infant how to make her mother happy by not crying, by not being hungry, by not having any needs at all. She suffered first from anorexia and then, throughout her adult life, from severe depression. Psychiatrists are denying this type of damage when they talk about grace and other spiritual qualities. In order to acknowledge the consequences of such early, hidden trauma, they would first have to do some hard work on themselves. Once they become willing to face the facts, their own facts, they will lose interest in teaching others about grace and other mysteries in the name of science. Clinging uncritically to traditional ideas and beliefs often serves to obscure or deny real facts of our life history. Without free access to these facts, the source of our ability to love will remain cut off. No wonder then that even well-intended moral appeals to be loving, caring, generous, and so forth are fruitless. We cannot really love if we are forbidden to know our truth, the truth about our parents and caregivers as well as about ourselves. We can only try to behave as if we were loving. But this hypocritical behavior is the opposite of love. It is confusing and deceptive, and it produces much helpless rage in the deceived person. This rage must be repressed in the presence of the pretended love, especially if one is dependent, as a child is, on the person who is masquerading in this illusion of love. We could make great progress in becoming more honest, respectful, and conscious, thus less destructive, if religious leaders could acknowledge and respect these simple psychological laws. Instead of ignoring them, they should open their eyes to the vast damage produced by hypocrisy in families and in society as a whole. Vera's letter to me, from which she asked me to quote, gives a clear example of this confusion and damage, and Maja's history shows how spontaneous love for a child eventually became possible for her once the repression of her past had been resolved. Vera, age 52, wrote, I had been a chronic alcoholic since adolescence, and I finally became sober thanks to Alcoholics Anonymous. I was so grateful for this liberation from my alcohol addiction that I attended every weekly meeting for 11 years. For a long time, I managed to ignore and override my own critical thoughts concerning the moral issues represented there. I even succeeded at first in not taking any notice of the serious illness I began to develop, eventually diagnosed as multiple sclerosis, and in making light of the symptoms. It was only when my depressive moods became longer and refused to disappear that I began to face my truth. It was very hard at first. When I succeeded in retrieving some repressed memories, they were close to unbearable. I wanted to stop, but my curiosity and my pain was stronger than my fear, and I decided to continue. During the first year of intensive work, some of my symptoms disappeared. Now, after 3 years of work with this method, I understand that these symptoms had to develop in order to wake me from my dangerous sleep so that I could finally take seriously my feelings, perceptions, and thoughts. I knew, for instance, that I had often become angry when unconditional love was discussed in the group meetings. I was apparently supposed to perceive and appreciate that all the members were giving me unconditional love. I was supposed to learn to trust them, and I felt guilty if I couldn't. It was explained to me that I could not trust and believe that love existed at all because I hadn't received love in my dysfunctional family of origin. I took these explanations for granted because I was longing so much for love and wanted to believe that I actually was loved. I was unable to question what I was told because hypocrisy had been the food I was fed daily by my mother. It was so familiar to me, though never questionable. But today I do question things that do not make sense to me. Today I would say, only a child needs, and absolutely needs, unconditional love. We must give it to the children who are entrusted to us. We must be able to love and accept them whatever they do, not only when they smile charmingly, but also when they cry and scream. But to pretend to love an adult unconditionally, that is, independently of his or her deeds, would mean that we should love even a cold serial murderer or a notorious liar if only he joins our group. Can we do that? Should we even try? Why? For whose sake? If we say that we love an adult unconditionally, we only prove our blindness and or dishonesty, nothing else. This is only one of many glimpses through the fog of religious heritage I tolerated in those meetings for much too long. I owe these insights to my lonely work. This ability to reason developed in me as I talked to my parents in my inner dialogue. It never occurred to me to have any conscious doubts when I was sitting in the meetings. I so desperately wanted to be loved, and that meant, of course, to comply, to be obedient. It was actually a very, very conditional love that was being offered there. Vera is right. As adults, we don't need unconditional love, not even from our therapists. This is a childhood need, one that can never be fulfilled later in life, and we are playing with illusions if we have never mourned this lost opportunity. But there are other things we can get from good therapists: reliability, honesty, respect, trust, empathy, understanding, and an ability to clarify their emotions so that they need not bother us with them. If a therapist promises unconditional love, we must protect ourselves from him, from his hypocrisy and lack of awareness. Vera was able to make an important discovery during her lonely work, thanks not only to the method she used, but also to her determination to find the truth and not allow herself to be deceived again. The changes in her body, once she paid attention to it, supported her on her path. Maja, 38, came to me several weeks after the birth of her third child and told me how free and alive she felt with this baby, quite in contrast to the way she had felt with her two previous children. With them, she had constantly felt that excessive demands were being made upon her, that she was a prisoner, and that the babies were taking advantage of her and exploiting her. Thus, she rebelled against their justified demands and, at the same time, felt that this was very bad of her. As in depression, she was separated from her true self. She thought these earlier reactions might have actually been rebellion against her mother's demands. For this time she was experiencing nothing of the sort. The love she had then struggled to feel now came of its own accord. She could enjoy her unity with this child and with herself. Then she spoke of her mother in the following words: "I was the jewel in my mother's crown. She often said, 'Maja can be relied upon, she will cope.' And I did cope. I brought up the smaller children for her so that she could get on with her professional career. She became more and more famous, but I never saw her happy. How often I longed for her in the evenings. The little ones cried and I comforted them, but I myself never cried. Who would have wanted a crying child? I could only win my mother's love if I was competent, understanding, and controlled, if I never questioned her actions or showed her how much I missed her. That would have limited her freedom, which she needed so much. It would have turned her against me. At that time, nobody ever would have thought that this quiet, competent, useful Maja could be so lonely and have suffered so much. What could I do but be proud of my mother and help her? The deeper the hole in my mother's heart, the bigger the jewels in her crown needed to be. My poor mother needed these jewels because, at bottom, all her activity served only to suppress something in herself, perhaps a longing, I don't know. Perhaps she would have discovered it if she had been fortunate enough to be a mother in more than a biological sense. And how all of this has repeated itself with Peter. How many empty hours my child had to spend with mother substitutes so that I could get my freedom, which only took me further away from him and from myself. Now that I know I was looking for a way to avoid my feelings when I deserted him, without seeing what I was doing to him, because I had never been able to experience my own sense of being deserted. Only now do I begin to realize what motherhood without crown or jewels or a halo can be like. A German women's magazine, which tries to speak openly of truths that have been taboo, published a reader's letter in which the tragic story of her experience of motherhood was told without disguise. Her report ends with the following passage: "And then the breastfeeding. The baby was put to the breast all wrong, and soon my nipples were all bitten. God, how that hurt. Just 2 hours and then it was back. Another one. The same. While it was sucking there, I was crying and swearing above it. It was so terrible that soon I couldn't eat anymore, and I had a temperature of 40 degrees Celsius. Then I was allowed to wean and suddenly felt better. It was a long time before I noticed any maternal feelings. I wouldn't have minded if the baby died. And everybody expected me to be happy. In despair, I telephoned a friend who said that I'd get fond of him in time through being busy with him and having him around all the time. But that did not happen either. I only began to be fond of him when I could go back to work and only saw him when I came home, as a distraction and toy, so to speak. But quite honestly, a little dog would have done just as well. Now that he is gradually getting bigger, and I see that I can train him and that he is devoted to me and trusts me, I am beginning to develop tender feelings for him, and am glad he is there. I have written all this because I think it is a good thing that someone should, at last, say that there is no such thing as mother love, not to speak of a maternal instinct. This woman could not really experience either her own tragedy or that of her child, since her own emotionally inaccessible childhood was the real beginning and the actual key to this story. Her negative statement is thus incorrect. In truth, mother love and maternal instincts do exist. We can see them at work when we observe animals that have not been mistreated by human beings. Women, too, are born with instinctual programming to love, support, protect, and nurture their children and to derive pleasure from doing so. But we are robbed of these instinctual abilities if we are exploited in our childhood for the substitute gratification of our parents' needs. Fortunately, however, as Johanna's story shows, we can also restore these abilities as soon as we are determined to face our truth. Johanna, age 25, began her therapy just before she became pregnant. She was well prepared for the birth and enjoyed bonding with her healthy newborn. She was happy that her milk was abundant and was anticipating the joys of breastfeeding when suddenly, apparently without reason, her breasts became hard and painful and she developed a high fever. She was distraught when the nurse had to feed the baby with a bottle. In her nightmares during the fever states, Johanna dreamed repeatedly and with many details of being sexually exploited in infancy by both of her parents and their friend. Thanks to the feelings that had been awakened in her self-therapy, she was able to feel her rage about the rape, the betrayal, and the damage to her instinctual capacity to fulfill her child's needs. This last of her parents' crimes was what made her most furious. She said later, "They robbed me of my maternal instincts when I was 3 months old. Because of what happened then, I was unable to breastfeed my child, although I wanted it so desperately." It took a long time for her to confront her parents in an inner dialogue, to express all the feelings of rage and indignation that were stored up in her body, and finally to overcome the effects of these violations. Even before this complete healing could take place, Johanna's willingness to face the horrible truth brought about a decrease in her temperature and an improvement in the condition of her breasts. She was able to feed her baby, who very quickly learned to dispense with the bottle. This came as a surprise to the nurse, who had been absolutely certain it would never work. Johanna was happy with her child. She enjoyed being able to love, to protect, to nurture, to hold her child, and to guess his needs. But this well-being was again and again interrupted by phases of doubt and fear that she would be confronted by catastrophic events if she continued to do what was simply a pleasure for her. As she had studied psychology, she wondered whether she suffered from an obsession and was just compelled to use her son for her own satisfaction, out of pure egoism. This painful self-condemnation was supported by her friends, who warned her about too much permissiveness and instructed her that a child needs to learn his limits from the beginning. Otherwise he will become a tyrant. Although Johanna respected these opinions for a long time, with her own child she was surprisingly sensitive to them and became quickly confused.